Today's interview is with veteran Harry Watson, born October 20th, 1922. He served in the U.S. Army Air Corps. Today's interview is taking place on April 13th, 2013 in Laguna Woods, California. Media Arts Center San Diego is conducting this interview on behalf of the Historical Society of Laguna Woods. The interview is being conducted for the Veterans History Project at the Library of Congress.
My name is Harry Watson, and I was born October the 20th, 1922, and I served in the Army Air Corps as a pilot.
Can you tell us the story of how you got into the service and a little bit about your training?
Back then, we were just coming out of a depression, and I graduated in 1940 from high school, and there were no jobs. So I decided I was going to go into the Air Corps and become an airplane mechanic. And that was my big dream. However, once I got in, then along came Pearl Harbor, and I decided then that I no longer wanted to be a mechanic, I wanted to be a pilot. I had to take a college equivalent exam, and I scored with a very high IQ. I didn't even know what intelligence quotient meant at the time, but I had my document there in front of me. So I went into the cadets, and I graduated in the top 2% of my class, the class of 43E. I graduated in Stockton. And I went to transition school in the C-47, which was used quite extensively in D-Day and from then on. I was fortunate enough to be kept on as an instructor. By the way, I'd never driven a car. And this turned out to be quite a fiasco when I was appointed Aerodrome Officer of the Day, and I was given a Jeep and told to pick up some field-grade officers that were coming in. And I ground every gear, and I stalled 6 or 7 times going out, and the same thing coming back. And it was in July of 1943, so it was really hot. It was in Austin, Texas. When I finally got to the point where I got them in the Jeep and was headed back, and I kept stalling and grinding and stalling and grinding. Finally, I found that if I pushed in on the clutch, it would go by itself. But then I would let out and it would stall. I got to the point where I was going to make the parking almost. And so I just pushed in on the clutch, and I glided up to this one part and where I'm supposed to park. And I let out on the clutch, and it stalled. So I wasn't about to start that thing up and move it 5 feet. I got out and I saluted as a major got out, and then a lieutenant colonel, and then a colonel, a full colonel. And every one of them, they saluted me, but they didn't look at me, and they just went, something like that. Finally, when the colonel got out, he saluted me. He just looked at me, and then he walked off. And he went about 3 steps, and he stopped, and he turned around, and he came back, and he leaned over, a big, tall guy, and he said, "Lieutenant, I sure hope you can fly better than you can drive." And by then, I was soaking wet with perspiration. I spent the rest of the afternoon, by the way, learning how to handle that Jeep. That brings me up to here. You want me to continue my...
Yeah, just tell us a couple of stories that you enjoyed from your time in the service, or that were interesting.
The interesting things came during my combat missions. After D-Day, we had to take the C-47, and we would take whole blood in and deliver it. And we carried 2 nurses on board, and we had 14 litters on each side of the aircraft, the aisle, so we could carry 28 litter patients. But my very first combat mission was into St. Mary Glees on the Cherbourg Peninsula. And I landed at this makeshift landing strip when we had sheets of metal that the engineers had laid down so we could land. And I delivered the whole blood, and then they loaded me up with a bunch of wounded. And that particular thing was repeated over and over and over again until they got past St. Lô, a huge battle at St. Lô in France. And once they broke out of that, then other factors on our forces ended up capturing Paris. And I was assigned the mail run, even though Paris was not in friendly hands yet. I was still assigned that. After you got out of St. Lô, the United States forces trapped a whole German army in a place called Falaise, F-A-I-L-A-S-E, and there's a little gap. And this German army was in full retreat. And the Americans sent in some P-47s to strafe them, and it was a turkey shoot because they stopped any movement forward on one side of the gap and any movement backward on the other side. And then they just slaughtered this whole army. One of my first trips to Paris, the next morning when we came out of there, I was on the way back, and up at 4,500 feet, I could smell rotting flesh. It was a real eye-opener. Right after that, we had the market gardens, a huge push by both the British and the Americans. We dropped a lot of paratroopers. We had 1,000 plane envoys. We went in with 1,000 or more. On the first day, we dropped paratroopers. And the second and third day, we towed gliders. And my right wingman was shot down on the third day. The Germans had 40 millimeter ACACs on the canals, on barges on the canals. And it was a turkey shoot. They just picked out whoever they wanted to shoot down. We were down about 300 feet and towing double gliders that day while we were going about 95 miles an hour. And the first pilot of that plane was Carl Carey. And his nephew later interviewed me because he was writing a book about his uncle. And then as the war went along, our main goal, and I'm brushing over this because it would take hours and hours, but our main goal was to supply Patton on his dash across Europe, and we would take off in the morning, early in the morning, with a plane load of jerry cans, which are 5-gallon containers of gasoline, and we would land in pastures and on roads and things of that sort, any place we could, so that we would get on the ground, get rid of our jerry cans, and Patton would pick them up on the way by. Sometimes he was there and sometimes he wasn't. There were times when we took small arms fire from the surrounding hills because Patton had quite yet arrived. And we had to unload all the jerry cans ourselves. And that was quite an affront because we weren't used to that. Anyway, as we were going across Europe, we got into Germany, and we started a place called Halle, H-A-L-L-E, Germany. We landed there. It was late at night. By late, it was dusk then. And so we unloaded our jerry cans, and then the armed forces there wouldn't let us take off. We did have a gadget on our aircraft called IFF, Identification Friend or Foe. If you didn't have that and you were flying around at night, if you didn't have it on, you would be shot down by your own fighters. So we had to spend the night. And it's the first time I've ever spent a night in a foxhole. And it probably doesn't sound bad to say, well, hey, yeah, I spent the whole night in a foxhole. Well, let me tell you, first of all, you have to dig it. And you have to dig pretty deep. And my crew chief and I were in one hole, and the radio operator and the co-pilot were in another hole. And I remember there was water in the bottom of the hole we dug. The water was seeping in, and also when you went to lean up against the side, mud is cold, really cold. And there was no way I was going to be able to sleep in a squatting position and not touch the sides of that. But the one point I wanted to make at that particular time, the Germans had been, 800 Germans had been bypassed by Patton on his dash across that part of it. And they were holed up in a forest. And they had 3 tanks. And everybody knew all of this. Well, and they had been there for maybe 3 or 4 days not doing anything. And the ACAC guys, anti-aircraft guys, told us that, hey, these people they're gonna break out. The Krauts are gonna break out tonight, so be on alert. Well, sure enough, I don't know what time it was, but you couldn't see, it was dark. But we heard a lot of small arms fire. And then we heard the chugging of these Tiger tanks. And every once in a while, the Tiger tanks, to intimidate whoever was around them, would blast a shell aimed at nobody in particular, because you couldn't tell where your enemies were or your friends or whatever. But I remember there was some moonlight, and this one tank was leading, and there was a tremendous number of Germans behind it, and you could make them out, shadowy. But he came up and he was going diagonally across where our 2 holes were, our foxholes, and he stopped. And I thought, uh-oh, man, they've seen us, and they're just going to either crush us with their tread, or they're going to point that big gun down here, and it's bye-bye. But this is what happened. The hatch came open, and a German stood up, crawled out. He stood on the treads first, and then he jumped down, and he looked all around, and then he urinated. And here we are, we're within, not spitting distance, but you could throw a stone. We're that close. And he just seemed to defy us. He wasn't afraid of us at all. And then he got back up in, and they chugged off. And every once in a while you'd hear a lot of small arms fire, and they were firing at nobody. They were just intimidating everyone around. And all we didn't have an army with us. We just had an ACAC battalion, anti-aircraft battalion. That's all we had. We were used primarily to return prisoners of war. And one of the worst instances of that was I took a bunch of Russian prisoners of war out of Belgium back to a place in Germany, but not in Russia. But they were Russians, and there were Russians there to accept these. And we were given a manifest, and like we always were, and my job was to deliver them and have them sign off that I delivered so many Russian POWs, and then they would take them. But the thing that really got to me, I was only 21 years old at the time, so here was this good-looking young Russian. He had black wavy hair, he had real deep dimples, flashy teeth, and he was blue-eyed, and he just stuck his head up front to see how, and he asked if he could speak English. He asked if he could come up front. And I told him, well, of course you can. So from there on, we had a long conversation during the whole trip. And he gave me the sickle, the star and sickle off of his cap as a memento. And then he reached in his pocket and pulled out all of his cash. And he says, here, Lieutenant, I want to give you this. And I wouldn't take it. I said, no, I can't take that. I said, I should be giving you something for everything you've done. And he said, no, you don't understand. He said, when we get back to Russia, they're going to kill us all. And boy, the co-pilot and I looked at each other, and we thought, I wonder if this is a come on or not. So we continued our flight, and he went into the back of the aircraft, and we had buckets on the floor in between the 2 sides, that in case you got sick while you had something to upchuck in. And he took those buckets and passed them among all of the other POWs and filled them with cash. And that, by the way, they were Belgian francs then, is what they had. But I mean, it was money. And I wouldn't take it, but the crew chief said, "Well, you mind if I take it?" And I said, "You're on your own. Just do whatever you think is right." And the guy again said, "Well, we're all going to be killed when we get there." I landed at this airport, and then I had to take the manifest and have it signed off by an American and a Russian. And the American was the lieutenant colonel, and I asked him, "Colonel, this young man that I brought over gave me this dog and pony show about getting repatriated by the Russians, that they'll assassinate all of them." And he said, "Oh, yes." And I said, "Well, just a minute." I said, "You mean to tell me they're going to kill these young kids?" He said, "Oh, yes. Anyone that gets outside of Russia can't get back in." He said, "They'll kill them all." And I said, "Are you going to let this guy take these boys?" And he said, "What do you want me to do?" And those were his remarks, and he left. He had signed off and took it to the Russian, signed off, and then he brought it back to me. So I had my manifest, and I did my job, but that's the way things happened in the war. Later, we were used to evacuate slave laborers. Have you ever heard of slave labor? The Germans, when they would capture a town, they would take all the able-bodied men and women and make them laborers, slave laborers. The very first time that we actually took out slave laborers was going into Pilsen, Czechoslovakia. And I knew there was no runway there, but they said, "Okay, it's a pasture, so you'll be able to find it, so don't worry." So we just headed out. And when I was about 4,000 feet or so, and we got within, say, 20 miles or 30 miles, about 30 miles away, I saw this big black area, and I thought, they'd been burned. So I conferred with my navigator, and he said, "That's where we're going to land." So I flew over it to make sure, because I was a flight leader, and I had some other aircraft on my wings. And as I peeled off and went around, I was able to look down, and it was people. Just a mass of people, and all dressed in black. So we came around and landed, and we taxied up. And we had to sit there a while until they got organized. There had to be 10 to 15,000 of them. And the one thing that, again, dumbfounded me was, while we're there, and I got outside the aircraft, I didn't dare go talk to them. I mean, I didn't know what to say, didn't know if they understood English or anything of that sort. But suddenly, a man and a woman broke out of the crowd and came out in full view of everything. And he took off his jacket. He had a black jacket. Everyone had a black jacket. Took off the black jacket, and he held it up, and he just held it up to no place in particular, because she had to go to the bathroom. And the thing that hit me was, they still maintained their integrity with everything they had been through. It was soul-searching for me, and I was young. Trust me, I was young. By then, I think I was 22. Yeah. We carried probably 15 plane loads apiece, each pilot in the squad. In our group, actually, we had 4 squadrons in our group, and that went on. I was called upon one time to do a cloak and dagger. I was told that I needed to take an empty plane load into Nuremberg, and they didn't identify Nuremberg until after I got everything ready and was ready for takeoff. But I flew it into Nuremberg, and this was just before the Russians overran Berlin. And my mission was to pick up a man. And when we got there, it was dark. and it was a pasture, not an airport, and it was dark, and I didn't know how I was going to get on the ground, but somehow or other they had arranged for jeeps and that to line up to show me a runway, and they turned their lights on, all of them together turned their lights on, and I landed and taxied up. Immediately all the lights went out, and MPs with their white helmets, etc., came forward, and they had a single man, and they put him on board with some guards, and it was the finance minister of Germany. His name was Franz von Papen, and it made headlines in the Stars and Stripes later. At the time, I didn't know who he was, and I read it on the Stars and Stripes. There were many, many things that happened that the horror of war, to finalize Market Gardens. After we went in on 1,000 raids and dropped all these paratroopers and towed all these gliders full of sticks of paratroopers and infantrymen and all kinds of equipment, the Germans were tough, and they isolated some of General Montgomery, which was English people, and hit them with flamethrowers. And our first mission after we went in there 6 times, taking all these soldiers in, was to remove some of the wounded. The first wounded that I flew out, every one of them had abdominal wounds. And this was near the end of September 1944. And we parked nose to tail while the ambulances would bring them wounded up, and we had 2 nurses for each C-47 for each plane. When they got them inside, these young men, they were conscious, but every one of them had abdominal wounds, and some of them were open. If you've ever smelled just plain flesh open, and then along with that, ruptured appendixes and the stomach and your large intestine and your small intestine and the bile and all of that. It was very hot, and there's no air conditioning or movement of air inside the C-47. And they loaded these 28 litter patients in there, and when I got on board to take off, I almost retched right there. It was just a smell, and they were all abdominal wounds, and we were allocated a certain place in England that we had to go to that treated abdominal wounds. The next thing was the burn patients, and we had, I'll never forget this, if you've ever smelled burned flesh, it never goes away. And all of these young men, and these were what we call limeys, the British, they were the ones hit by the flamethrowers. And we took out plane load after plane load that one day. The incredible thing about it is none of the wounded and none of the burn patients complained, not one time. There wasn't one complaint. You'd hear them groan slightly, but they were just so happy that they're alive and that they're going to be taken back to England and no longer see the war. And for a young person like myself, and I hadn't ventured more than 30 miles from home during my first 18 years before I joined the service, so it was quite an experience. I've never forgotten it. It had a great deal to do with what I am today because I became an airline pilot right after the war, and I flew for Continental Airlines for 32 years. Great career. But more than anything, it taught me one thing, that there were many wars after World War II, but man needs to understand that in a war, nobody wins. I don't care if you declare yourself the winner, you have got scars and losses that will haunt you the rest of your life. I lost my best friend, the one I went through cadets with. His name was Golden Lang. He was a state mile champion in the mile in Utah. And the first day that I met him, we bonded. I was a track man too, but I was in the shorter distances. And we went through cadets together. We got married the same day. He was a Mormon, and I married a Catholic. We both knew that we were gonna be killed, and we accepted it. And so that's the only reason I got married, because I knew I wasn't coming back. I met him later. I went into this one, the C-47 and a troop carrier command, and he went into B-24 bombers. I met him overseas. He flew by my base at Greenham Commons one day, and he was in a P-47, and he taxied up and got out, and we just hugged each other. We hadn't seen it for months and months and months. And he had finished up his 35 missions as a bomber pilot, and he asked me if I wanted to take it around. Well, I couldn't wait to get my hands on a fighter, and I had quite a bit of fun buzzing our Quonset huts where we all lived. And of course everybody came out, and I wasn't supposed to do that, but it was a lot of fun, just great fun. 15 days before the end of the war, he was killed in a B-24 crash. And up until just recently, when the flag pole broke, I flew a flag 24/7 in his honors. But this has just been like a couple of months ago that the flag that I had up, somehow or other it broke. The pole broke. But I don't see that you can actually conquer somebody and make them live up to your standards. I saw too many of the FFF, the Free French Forces, many times. And these were people who hid in the underground and killed Germans. My first trip into Paris, it was still controlled by the Germans. And I remember we had a hotel, but it was all dark, and the elevator didn't work, and it was a little tiny elevator anyway. But I remember getting from the Jeep into the hotel, and we heard small arms fire in, maybe 3 or 4 or 5 blocks away. And that went on all night, and they finally told me. I asked them at the desk, what's all this? I said, they cleaning out the Germans. They said, no, the Germans are trying to escape, and they're killing whoever they can in an effort to get. That was the end of August in 1944, not too long after D-Day.